Welcome to Life Science Marketing Radio, the podcast where marketing leaders inside and outside the sciences share their creative ideas and practical approaches to increasing your marketing ROI. Here's your host, Chris Connor.
Larry Koplow is an independent brand strategist, and as you might guess, that's exactly what we're going to talk about today, brand strategy. Larry, welcome to LSMR.
Hey, thanks for having me.
All right, we're going to start off with the basics. Just define brand strategy in terms of the goal, why to have one, and why it's important.
Sure. So what I like to do is kind of first talk about the danger of not having a brand strategy or having a strategy behind your brand. So a lot of times your company can have the most groundbreaking scientific platform or technology. It can address a critical need in the marketplace for researchers or for patients. For doctors, it can seem obvious to you, to everyone around you, anyone who listens, that tech should sell itself, right? So that's what you go out with. You talk about your tech. But the tough thing is that people are selfish. Researchers, investors, HCPs, patients, hospitals, policymakers, caregivers, they only care about themselves. And they should, right? Because otherwise they wouldn't be able to filter out all these things that people are trying to say to them. All these marketing messages, content, information, social posts, all these things, all this content about game-changing solutions that they are inundated with every minute of every day. And it's not just advertising, right? It's articles, product placement, social posts, convention exhibits, right? Peer-to-peer recommendations, PR, white papers, all these things that people are using to try and get your attention. The goal of brand strategy is really, especially in life science, is to cut through all that noise and act as a foundation for all your communications to connect your innovations to your audiences so they know what's in it for them. So the way I look at defining brand and brand strategy is first talk about brand, because it really helps to crystallize, what we're trying to build. And there are a lot of ways to define brand. Jeff Bezos defines brand a certain way. Others define it a certain way. The one I found that's most helpful, I'll give a shout out to Yuli Applebaum. He, in his book, set out a definition that I think is really useful. It's this idea of brand is the sum of all the associations your audiences have about you. Your brand is what your audiences think about you through all the different touch points that you have, whether it's communication, in store, in person, sales calls, investor decks, all those things build up these associations, and that's your brand. Your brand is your perception, right? So having an intentional strategy behind your brand means you're taking control of this perception and building up those different associations and connections with your audience. So building your brand is really representing your company consistently in a way that you want, with intention at every touch point and meeting your audiences where they are. Because the danger is, if you're not immediately and consistently relevant and you can't own a space in your audience's mind, then you're going to be overlooked or ignored at best, right? Or even worse, misunderstood. And that's kind of the biggest danger of not taking control of the narrative.
Tell me what you think about this, and then we'll jump into some examples. So as you say that, I mean, it's not hard to imagine. Every company is focused on its tech. That's what you live and breathe every day. But the people you're trying to reach, you think that's all they want in their work life, but they're being hammered not only with advertisers from other tech and content and so on and emails, there's everything else in their life. And it's just harder to hold on to that level of detail around a single thing. And there's maybe a different place in your brain where that brand association is easier to hold and get back in touch with. And you go, oh yeah, those guys, I like them because, and they have this amazing tech.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. And ultimately, sometimes clients come to me or companies come to me and they go, we have so many different audiences. Shouldn't we represent a different thing to different audiences? And really the answer usually, not always, but usually is no. You should represent one thing to your audiences because they can own that space. You can own that space in their mind so that when they think of your company, they think of X. And that's what you represent. And that's what you can reinforce anytime you talk to them or you communicate to them or you have a sales call or you have an investor pitch or anything. It's, I want to be the X company, whether it's the tech company or the safety company or whatever matters to your audience in a way that you can solve a specific challenge for them.
So I'm thinking of it now as maybe an easy access door to your value proposition. I mean, it's not the value prop, but it's the way, the first thought that gets you going toward the other things you want to communicate. So give us some examples of, brands that work well, don't work well, people that struggle, companies.
Sure. I'll give you one specific example kind of here. And then as we go through, we can talk about different examples of different things that answer different brand strategy challenges or communication challenges. But the one that comes to mind, I think, is one that we talked about a little bit ago, Thermo Fisher and their toxicology solutions. So a while ago, I think we talked about the challenges of building a brand around toxicology solutions, especially when it comes to mass spec. Thermo Fisher, had been trying for years to figure out how to lead with brand, how to solve for a number of different challenges in the space, right? How to convince audiences first to move from clean chem assays over to mass spec. That's kind of the first one, right? Why should I even use mass spec in this space? How do you differentiate and brand Thermo Fisher and their instruments and workflow solutions in a field that relies on personal relationships? I happen to know my rep, or I happen to know a person who uses this, so that's what I'm going to use. And a third challenge is trying to address very different audience types. And we were looking at least 4 different audience types with very different sets of motivations. There are forensic crime labs, reference labs like workplace drug testing or addiction recovery, university labs and hospital labs, those that are in the ER, but also those that do broader mass spec research. And then the most interesting to me was anti-doping labs in the sports field, both for athletes, but also for horses, for camels, which was surprising that it's such a big industry. I had no idea. So all these things that you get to learn as you dive deep into this stuff. So as we're going through and doing the homework, and we'll talk about that in a little bit, you really need to do the homework in order to be able to understand this. A really key insight, and by insight, the way I define insight is it's a truth that you either didn't know about, undiscovered, or under-examined that can affect how people think about your brand or how you think about the market or your customers. It's these truths that we don't know about, that we don't learn about until we dive in. So a key insight here was that as you break down those different types of audiences, they could really be broken down into 2 different groups. First, labs that were looking to grow their business. So these entrepreneurs, right? These ones that were looking to create mass spec solutions, use mass spec solutions in a way that put them above their competitors. And then labs that were looking to push the boundaries of research in the toxicology space. And so in both of these cases, the underlying pattern was that the motivations relied on research partners like Thermo Fisher that could support forward movement in the field, whether it's for their business or for their research. And this was a kind of a key jumping off point that led to Breakthrough Creative and led through to an opportunity to lead with brand in a way that they hadn't before. It was this idea of pushing toxicology forward toward new possibilities to expand your research or grow your business. And this was something that could resonate at a broad level and can resonate with each of your individual audiences that meant something to them.
Oh man. Okay, so you touched a nerve. I wish I'd met you 13 years ago because I worked in mass spec at
Yeah.
Thermo Fisher. And I'll tell you, one of my biggest challenges there, I was the director of marketing communications. They were always, I was always getting hammered for more leads. And
Right.
they were talking about these new applications. And I'm going, well, instead of like reaching out more to the people who already use mass spec, how do we get the people who should be using mass spec that aren't? And how do we
Yeah.
educate them?
Yeah.
That's like,
That was a tough one. And I know you had been in that space, and I know that was a tough nut to crack. And it was a tough insight to uncover. But once you dive deep and kind of see where the patterns are and see where you can make those connections, all of a sudden, you know, as long as it's something that's true to you and works for the marketplace, you can go in a few different directions. It's just got to work. In this case, it hit a nerve, and that's something that was common in the field and common with different types of audiences, that all of a sudden we could speak with the same voice.
yeah. And the best thing about that whole story you just told was there was nothing about sensitivity or resolution in any of it.
Right. That backs it up. And once you become a that kind of provider that can help them do that, sensitivity, specificity, your advances in workflow, those are things that support it. You don't lead with it, because then it's a battle of specs, right?
Right.
It's and you're not going to necessarily win that battle unless you have a super advanced technology that changes the game. And that may be the case, but people still care about themselves. They don't necessarily care about what you're trying to tell them.
Yeah. That was awesome. All right. So let's talk about how can a company, oh my God, how can a company ensure that the story they're telling now is true to its identity and relevant to all those audiences?
Sure. So the biggest thing is that you really need to do the homework. A lot of times companies will come in and they'll go, we just need more PR. We need to say we need to reach more people. We and usually we can do more PR, or we could do more outreach and do more messaging. They want messaging, but a lot of times the answer is, do you need to say what you're saying only louder? Is that going to work? Or do you need to take a step back and do the homework? Figure out what you're trying to say at a foundational level to make sure that your communications are reaching your audiences where they are, telling a consistent story, and are always on brand. So, as we talked about, you represent that one thing to all of your audiences. And so, when I talk to different companies, I talk about 4 measures of success in order to reach audiences where they are. So the first one is your brand story or your brand strategy or your position, depending on how we're approaching things, is it relevant and more often meaningful? Meaning, is it actionable to your key audiences? Does it address motivations, overcome barriers, overcome pain points? Is it reaching them where they are? The second one, and it's important when you talk about being true to your identity, is it a compelling story that's true to what you want to say? Does it capture your story, but does it also capture your audience's imaginations? Are you able to find something that does both? Third, is it differentiated in the marketplace? Is it different from competitors? Can you own a unique space in your audience's mind that's different from somebody else? And can you find a competitive white space that is someplace that your competitors aren't talking about? And then the fourth, and this is important, and something I think we'll talk about later on, and isn't always talked about, but it's super important. The idea of, is it comprehensive? Does it cover everything you want to say and empower you to communicate consistently at all these different levels of what you want to say? From your elevator pitch, that's usually the easiest thing to do, but not always, because people tell their stories differently and different people at the company tell them differently. But Does it allow you to tell your story at the elevator pitch, all the way down to the deepest levels of your platform, your tech, the differences in your mass spec versus someone else's mass spec approaches, and ladder up to that same overarching brand position? If you can, then it doesn't matter where you're telling your story or who you're telling your story to. You can tell in different ways and pick up the conversation at different parts, but you're still laddering back to that same brand. So ultimately, it's like when we talk about doing the homework, we're talking about making sure that you kind of know that you don't have the answers. Unless you've been the customer, it's tough to know what those insights are, those answers are. And so I'm sure you've heard that quote, and I always forget whether it's Scott Galloway or Blair Enns or whoever came up with it first, but that you can't read the label from inside the bottle. And I use this, anyone you talk to that's worked with me, they're like, what he says is you can't read the label from inside the bottle. I use that all the time. You have to speak to your audiences, all of your different audiences, and know what's relevant and meaningful to them and what matters most to them. That's the only way to uncover these insights that we're talking about, these unexamined or overlooked truths that you wouldn't be able to see if you just saw things from your point of view. So one of the biggest things is to take a step back, do the homework, and know who your audiences are. Not just your target audiences or your target customers, but your whole universe of audiences, because you may have indirect influencers, you may have regulatory, you may be talking about investors, or you may be targeting HCPs or hospitals, but you also need to take a step back and look at investors behind your tech. How do you break down these targets? How do you look at audiences from a universal perspective and know what they're looking for? Who do these guys work for? Where are they in their research career? You got to get specific and define what those motivations are. And then you can look for patterns and commonalities. Look at what the market's telling you, what's most important to your audiences. And then you can look at those 4 measures of success and say, is this the brand story? Is this the brand position that's true to us and meaningful to our marketplace?
Yeah. So I always attribute that reading the label from inside the bottle to Scott Galloway. I love that quote. I mean, it happened to me yesterday. Like I was talking to somebody and she's telling me all about, my podcasts, and I'm just going, oh, really? And it, it was very nice to hear, but it's stuff that when I'm thinking about it, that's not how I think about it.
You don't, right?
And so, and I know it happens all the time, and I see it, and I try to do it for other people. Like, oh, here's what I see. Anyway,
right.
Talk about measurement and reading, getting someone else to read the label for you, looking from outside yourself. My other question, maybe you can work this in, is that challenge of communicating on all levels without becoming so dilute that it's meaningless. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, to be able to talk about an elevator pitch and an overall thing, a more detailed thing, and not have it just be mush.
I think we might talk about that a little bit later in kind of the communication structure.
Yeah, and the architecture. Okay.
Yeah, and the architecture. And actually, I kind of like, I think you might find this interesting. Is like, I talk about architecture kind of a different way than I talk about communication structure. And when you think about architecture, you think about brand architecture and like hybrid models versus endorse. And it's like, that's kind of a different animal, and the terminology is kind of different. So when we get to that, we can talk about that.
Talk about measurement and reading, getting someone else to help you read the label.
Yeah. Yeah. And like, there's a interesting example of things that you just don't know about your audiences. I was working with a company that works in the medication management space for hospitals. And for years, they had been talking about their groundbreaking RFID technology, that isn't necessarily groundbreaking outside the hospital, but within the hospital, RFID technology is kind of groundbreaking in that it tracks and traces medications from its source all the way to bedside throughout the hospital, in the ER, on the floor, patient bedside. It travels all the way through. But they'd reached a sticking point because this technology story just wasn't resonating, and everybody was starting the story at a different place. So as we took a deep dive, the key insight was something that they said up front, but it wasn't something that they really meant. But their audiences were saying it loud and clear. Hospitals hate technology. And they're coming in with a tech story, right? Hospitals hate talking about technology. They hate bringing it in. They rely on paper trails. They rely on fax machines. They don't like necessarily bringing in the IT department because then you're talking about expensive upgrades and server farms, but you're also talking about patient confidentiality, right? Not being being careful about how you talk about patient information. So one of the things we need to do was get them off the tech story and reframe the conversation. Stakeholders consistently told us from outside, from within the hospital, directors of operation, directors of pharmacy, anesthesiologists, they all consistently referred to patient and hospital safety as their number one priority. Whether they were talking about anything else, tech or whatever, they kept coming back to patient safety, making sure patients get the right medications at the right time in the right dose, and more importantly, not getting the wrong medication, right? That was even more important than getting the right medication. And protecting hospitals against diversion events. Huge issue in the hospital. So hospital safety and patient safety. So once we reframe that conversation around that, we have the opportunity not to lead with tech, which is immediately the walls are coming up, right? I don't want to talk about tech. I'm a hospital. To hospital safety, patient safety. What this did was not only kind of work with IT and through IT and kind of overcome that resistance, it allowed specifically directors of operations to see how it fit within what they were talking about and fit within their budgets, more importantly, because they have a space in their P&L for patient safety and hospital safety. Things like infection prevention fall under their budget, and they don't necessarily have to go up to the C-suite to get it approved. They already have it. And so by speaking to what's most important to them and the fact that you are creating this environment of safety around your patients, around your hospitals, now you have a jumping off point that they're going to hear you because it's important to them and they have control over it versus tech, which isn't something that's important to them. Or it's important to them, but it isn't something that they necessarily are comfortable with.
Yeah, I like that. Leading with the problem, essentially, and not the solution.
And what's relevant to your audiences, right?
Yeah, and that whole idea, like there is budget for this if you present it right. And like, that's amazing. All right, so in a market where lots of companies seem to be commoditized, let's talk about, if you can't differentiate, can you use a brand personality archetype to differentiate, for example, a large life science company? And then maybe some examples.
Yeah, sure. So commoditization is, there's a lot of it in life science. It can affect big, multifaceted companies, but we're often presented that challenge with service providers like CROs, CDMOs, where they can all seem like they provide very similar services, very similar benefits. So leaning into a brand personality archetype can help establish a connection to audiences and build that brand presence, especially if you don't have something that is uniquely different about your value prop that leads to an insight that we can leverage. And it's really hard to build a brand just on archetypes. Usually we can find a differentiator. Even with CDMOs or CROs, usually we can find something that helps them find a communication white space. But if there's truly, and then you can use brand archetypes as a support for that and help build your brand tone. But if you truly need to build it off of a brand archetype, there are companies that have done it. So a little bit about brand personality archetypes. If you're not familiar with them, you could go down a rabbit hole. It's so much fun. So it's this tool that leverages 12 or so. There are different charts, but 12 or so familiar personality archetypes that help define tone and help audiences understand the relationship with you. It was originally developed by Carl Jung way back in the last century, but then it was applied to brands by that Mark and Pearson book, The Hero and the Outlaw. So essentially, you build your brand archetype, your brand personality archetype, to help your audiences understand their relationship with you. And the interesting thing is that you don't always want to be the same archetype as your audience. You're building a relationship, so you don't always want to be their friend or mirror them. But there are a number of different ways. To me, there are kind of 4 different ways that you can build that relationship through this familiar personality type, or building off of the stories that you already know and building them up from there. So the first is you can mirror. You can create a sense of belonging, or this sense of togetherness. We're in this together. I'm mirroring what's important to you, characteristics, language, tone. You see this one of the classic examples is Harley Davidson, creating this community. But another one is where Taco Bell's kind of gone. They kind of create this community where we're all, in this space together. Another way is you can create a sense of aspiration, right? Represent what your audiences aspire to be. Nike, I want to be like Mike. That is the classic example, right? You're creating this aspirational brand. A third way, and we see this a lot actually in the life science space, is guidance and reassurance. We have the answers that you need. We're assuring you that you know the pathway to safety or success. You see this during, if you watch golf, or you watch football, it's like all of those financial firms or legal firms or home protection, they all have the answers, and you can be reassured that they have the answers. And then the fourth way, and that I found, is you can inspire your audiences. You can motivate your audiences to believe in themselves and achieve what they want in life. Dove is a great recent example. Indeed, job search. You can find what you want. We are inspiring you to become your better self. That's kind of different ways in. So when you're creating this relationship, if you're really building it on, if you're using it as a build on a true unique value prop differentiator, awesome. But if you're trying to build a brand just on an archetype, and I have a couple of examples of this, you really have to reinforce it at every touch point, because it needs to be not only lip service, it needs to be your brand. It's not just your advertising. It's got to be your in-store experience, your sales experience, your investor experience, your convention experience. You've got to live it in order for it to be true. Otherwise, if you speak differently, if you have a communication that speaks differently one way than the other, you're watering down your brand, and you're going to represent different things to your audiences at different times.
Yeah, it sounds like, if you don't have the initial differentiator that you're building your brand archetype off of, there has to be some connection between your umbrella of a brand and the actual experience at every other level. Otherwise, again, it's not going to stick, right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
So do you have some examples? You mentioned CROs and CDMOs. I find these interesting because I look at a lot of them and I'm going, some have some unique capability here or there, and I don't mean to diminish their importance, but it's like, which local car repair shop am I going to? It's a service. You're going to do this thing.
But even with that, it's whether they have true differentiators or not. If you can speak about what's most important to your audiences, or speak in a way that others aren't, you can start to build a brand off of that. The first one that's really relatable and kind of true to my heart is I used to write TV ads for KFC and for Taco Bell, and then a lot of other general uh, consumer products. But I really like fast food marketing. I don't want I just really like it. And so if you look at McDonald's versus Burger King, that is the classic example of we have the same thing. We sell the same thing. We sell burgers, we sell nuggets, we sell fries. We sell exactly the same thing. But McDonald's, you know, is a way stronger brand. Nobody's kids are shouting to stop at Burger King on a road trip. Nobody. Um, and they built
That's
it
funny.
intentionally, right? They built it through archetype, through a personality. And they're, you know, of the 12, they've built it based off of kind of what's called the innocent. It's mirroring a shared experience and bringing people into the community and creating the shared experience with their audience. And it relies on honesty, simplicity, love, but most of all, happiness. They want to make you feel at every point when you communicate with them or you're in store, they want to make you feel nostalgic and they want to spread joy. You know when an ad is from McDonald's and when it isn't. Their brand is woven into their products, it's woven into their in-store experience. Their kids' meals are called Happy Meals, right? So every time your kid on a road trip shouts out Happy Meal, they're creating a deeper brand association. It's like that definition, right? If there's some of your association, every time they shout out Happy Meal, they're creating a deeper brand association. So when they grow up, they're going to associate McDonald's with happiness. And that means their kids are going to be shouting out for Happy Meals. It's what's made their brand hugely successful. They reinforce it at every touch point. So Burger King, on the other hand, what do we feel about it? My kids feel nothing about it. They've actually never been to Burger King. You know, the recent advertising, and it was actually done by OKRP here in Chicago. Awesome. My kids know the jingle. I know the jingle. Everyone knows it. It's kind of this every man empowering, you rule, belonging kind of thing. But just a few years ago, they were advertising with that creepy big head Burger King guy, that mascot, right? That it was kind of a jester archetype. And neither of those things have anything to do with when you walk into that store, it doesn't matter. I feel nothing. There's no in-store experience. Their products don't relate to it. So their brand doesn't really build up a set of associations and you don't connect it with anything. So I don't think of anything when I think of Burger King except for the song, which is awesome. They're, you know, kind of closer to our industry in the life science space. I think you can look at two of the top CROs in the space. So Parexel and IQVIA. Two very different brand archetypes, at least in the way they present themselves. I've never worked with either one of them, so I don't know their day-to-day experience. But Parexel, if you look at how they talk about themselves, consistently they talk about doing things with heart, focusing on patient first. They're a caregiver. They provide service and structure with emotion. They're mirroring what they think is important to their audiences. And we actually, when I do interviews, most everyone says, we do this for patients. Our whole goal is we are trying to do this for patients. And that it can be true, but you can't just give it lip service. If you just have a headline or you have one thing that says, oh, by the way, it's for patients, or you throw a picture of a patient on your website, but you're not paying it off at every touch point, that's not a brand. That's just a headline or it's just an image. You have to infuse it in every touch point and be consistent about it. IQVIA, on the other hand, does what a lot of CROs do. They present themselves more as that financial firm that we talked about, right? They are a sage or they're the hero. They're leading with tech. They're leading with technical expertise. We have the answers. They're not trying to mirror what's important to their audiences. They're looking to provide guidance and reassurance that they have the answers for you. Everything is reinforced with this tech story. Great. Awesome way to go. Two very different companies, or two similar companies actually, with very different ways of approaching how they talk to audiences and that space that they're trying to own in their audience's mind.
Nice. Yeah, the thing I remember about Burger King is, I mean, from when I was a kid, have it your way, which is still sort of the you rule, you're in charge. That's what I remember.
Yeah.
But yeah, it doesn't penetrate the way the McDonald's brand does.
Yeah, that's why McDonald's will never be knocked off. It doesn't matter what Burger King does. Sorry.
That's all right. I'm going to take a break here real quick. So we got construction going on outside. All right. Shifting a little bit. So smaller biotech firms finding a true differentiator that resonates, even though each little biotech, of course, has its own unique technology that they're getting started off of. Maybe they're seen the same way by investors. How do I choose between these? So what are the strategies those companies use to identify and communicate their value props?
Yeah, it's interesting. It's kind of similar to that challenge we talked about where they want to come to you and they want more publicity, more press releases. We need to say what we're saying only louder. And is that going to work? It might, but probably not. So the big thing is to know when to take a step back and look at the strategy behind your brand. Know when it helps to see how we can make connections to our audiences and know what we don't know. So that's a pretty common challenge. It seems like our tech is so awesome and obvious and important that it should just sell itself. And when it doesn't, it's marketing's fault, or it's the sales team's fault, or it's somebody's fault. It's not what we're saying, it's how we're saying it. It's important to, at that point, to know what you don't know and take a step back and look at your brand position. What are your value props within the context of the market? So your value props, all those great things that people get in working with you or buying from you or working for you, communicated in a way that is relevant and meaningful to those audiences and different from what everybody else is saying. So the big thing you can do, especially as a smaller biotech, is to do the homework. Talk to internal stakeholders. Help them set out what you believe, what your true differentiators are, because you may not know. Help determine what it is that you want to say. So talk to all of your departments: sales, marketing, product development, business development, C-suite, medical affairs, regulatory. All those different folks have different ways of talking about what's important to the brand, to the company, and why they work there in the first place, and what they think it is they're selling. Then you can use that and pressure test it against what your audiences believe, either through qualitative research or quantitative research, or hopefully both. Find out what's important to them, look for consistencies and patterns, and then see how you can apply what you think is important to what your audiences think is important. And that's kind of a big step in not only building your brand position, but building your eventual go-to-market strategy and your brand planning for the next 12 to 18 months. See where you can have the greatest impact based off of what's most important to your audiences. And then you can do a competitive white space analysis, not just in terms of what your competitors provide to the marketplace, but how they're talking about themselves. What perceptions do audiences have about those different competitors? What opportunity is there to tell a different story from what people perceive in the marketplace? What do they think of you? Communicating what you want to say, your value props within the context of the market, what is important to them and what's different from what everyone else is saying, that can help you define a unique way in that's going to mean something to your audiences. And the biggest thing is just know what you don't know, right? You probably don't have those answers internally. You got to do the work.
Yeah, that's interesting. So let's talk about, I don't know a lot about the smaller biotech space. I just always imagine, a bunch of scientists hunkered down and a founder somewhere, and
Yeah.
not even enough of, self-awareness of what they're trying to do yet. I mean, they're still figuring it out, and you don't get a lot of feedback, right? I mean, because
Yeah.
but let's talk about, their most important audience, so investors and you
Yeah.
and I spoke previously, and this got my attention for those folks. So investors looking for a long-term brand vision, not just what can we do on the first, product release, but how does this have a longer term life? So how do they craft their messaging in that context?
Sure. So one of the important things to kind of know going in is that investors are people. It's just like doctors will come to you and they'll say, we only look at the data. No, you don't. You're a person like everybody else. You're affected by how people communicate. You're affected by what's important to you. You're affected by brand, whether you know it or not. So the first thing is really to be honest that investors are one of your key audiences, because that doesn't always come up right away. For the smaller biotechs, yep, absolutely. But for the mid-size or the larger ones that may not be looking at investors as a primary target audience, it's important to include them in the universe of audiences, especially if you're looking eventually to sell to a pharmaceutical company or something like that. So that's one thing. It's important to know what type of investor you're talking about. We talk about long-term investors, but there are also ones that want more immediate returns. So know if those are the types of investors you're talking about. They may just be talking about going after that first application, that low-hanging fruit. That's where you're going to make your money. So they may say, you got to lean into that. You got to make your sales. Don't worry about building your brand over the long term, because if you don't make sales now, you're not going to have a company to build a brand over the long term anyway, right? Just like, sorry. So as you're looking at those investors that are looking at the short term, know if that's what's most important to you, and then you can go after that. Investors with a longer term outlook, though, they're looking for a brand story, just like your other target audiences. It's important to have that brand through line in your investor deck, just like you would with your sales deck or your website. Because if your investor deck comes across as just a series of slides, and we've all seen those investor decks that start with who we have on our board, who we have on our in our leadership team. Here's what we believe in. Here's our platform. Here are the logos of companies that we work with or have worked with. It's like there's no brand story there. If an investor is looking truly at a long-term play, they're going to want to look at not only the strength of your leadership team, your technology, your pipeline, your market potential. They're going to be not only drawn in by your brand story, but they want to know that you have a brand to build over the long term. So sometimes they may even see it before you do. The experienced ones are going to see that brand story and may see that communication potential even before the leadership team does, because they've been doing it more than this leadership team does. So it's usually important to treat those investors like you do your other audiences, right? Develop a strong brand position that empowers this natural conversation around what you're solving for your audiences, so that you can build that story and build that brand over the long term, so that it's going to make your company successful over the long term, and it's going to make it valuable and build equity and build your brand over the long term.
Nice. All right. Last question. We're going to wrap up on balancing messages like we hinted at earlier across different areas like company brand, technology, applications. So talk about brand architecture and how to do that consistently so that it works at all those levels but holds together.
Yeah, sure. So when I think of brand architecture, I actually think of brand architecture versus what I like to call a communication structure. So when you talk about brand architecture, I think of different brands that are coming together, especially when you talk about acquisitions or mergers. How are we going to categorize each brand? What are the components of each brand? How do they fit together? A lot of times I'll get clients that come to me and go, we just purchased X, Y, and Z brand. Now figure out our story, figure out how it all fits together. Um, which we can do, but it's like being more intentional about that helps you determine what your ultimate brand architecture could be. Are we a house of brands like Danaher or P&G, where every brand is individual? It's independently named, it has its own brand equity. Or are you a branded house, which kind of the flip side of it, where you have a strong central brand. Thermo Fisher
Thermo
is the brand. FedEx is the brand. You may have some sub brands underneath it, but you lead with that strong equity. Or is it somewhere in between, right? Is it a mixed model? Is it a hybrid model? J&J has an endorsed set of brands. Marriott has an endorsed set of brands. It's where the overarching brand supports the sub brand and you have a balance of equity. So that's kind of when I think of brand architecture, I think of it that way. Versus when you're talking about what I call like a communication structure or a communication framework for an individual company. That helps, especially when you ask the first question. Well, the first question is, what are we looking to solve? But the second question is, okay, tell me your brand story. Tell me about your company at a high level. And everyone starts somewhere different. Someone over here starts with the tech because they are in tech. Someone over here, sales, is looking for what the solutions are out there. Someone else in the C-suite is talking about the brand mission or the brand vision or their values. Everyone starts someplace different, which means you don't have a brand. You don't have something that you're building on. And a lot of times they'll come in and they'll say, there's so much, we have so many audiences. There's so much to talk about. Everything is equally important. I don't know where to begin. We need 4 different positions. And if you remember, one of the measures of success is, does your brand strategy and does your position, is it comprehensive? Does it tell everything that you want to tell underneath that same umbrella so you can ladder up and speak to that same brand? So one of the things you want to be able to do is pressure test it against, say, a communication structure or communication framework where you can start to separate out what is the different parts of how you talk about your company. How do we talk about the company at a company level? We can talk about mission. We can talk about vision. We can talk about values. And this is going to be really important because no one comes to work for a platform, right? When you are recruiting, they come to work for a company. Employees and potential employees, recruiting are one of your key audiences, especially if you're looking to brand, the brand yourself in the larger sense. Then, as you're looking at the structure, where does your tech fit in? Where does your platform fit into that larger story? Can you talk about it at a high level, its game-changing nature and all these things that it's bringing to the marketplace? And can you talk about it at a deep level, the deepest parts of your mass spec, how it's different from your competitors, the deepest level of your platform, and then be able to speak to that underneath your brand position. This is going to be especially important for those long-term investors that we talked about because your company has to have legs over the long term. And it's going to be important, especially to those employees who are excited about this technology. It's why they came to work for you. They came to work for a company, but they really wanted to work on this technology. And then how do you speak to your application or your first set of applications? Say your first application, I worked recently with a company whose first application was for prostate cancer screening. So how do you speak to PCPs? How do you speak to urologists? Can you do so in a way that, yeah, we're speaking to those audiences, but they don't care about your tech. They don't care about your company. They care about what this specific application does. Can you speak to that application in the same way that does it ladder up to that position in the same way that your platform does, that your company does? If you can, now you're starting to create those brand associations and you're doing it at every touch point, regardless of whether you're talking to an investor or you're talking to potential recruits or you're talking to those who are going to use your first application and you're speaking to it at the same brand. Ultimately, different things are important to different audiences, and you're going to have different conversations along the way. And you're going to reach out through different media at different times of their customer journey. But if you can have those conversations and then they still ladder up to that same position, that means you're always going to be on brand. And that's going to add a ton of credibility to your company and a ton of value to your company and help build your brand over the long term.
That is a perfect place to wrap up. I mean, just tying it all together at every level. I love that example. And I'll just throw out employer branding is something that I think is overlooked. I've been trying to get somebody on this podcast to talk about employer branding for a long time because I think it's fascinating. Like, it's not just for your customers. It's like how you get the talent that's going to bring more customers. So
exactly.
Yeah, awesome. Larry Koplow, this has been a treat. Thank you so much for sharing that. All of that. I think people are going to get a lot out of this one.
That's great. It was a lot of fun.
Hey, if you're still listening, that tells me you enjoyed the podcast. But don't tell me, tell your friends, and I'll be back soon with another episode. Okay, you can tell me too. Send an email, chris@lifesciencemarketingradio.com. Bye-bye.